Welcome to Let's Talk, straight talk, hard topics, smart people. I'm Stephen Graves, and I'm here at the SNMMI conference here in Toronto. I'm talking with Dr. Robert Hobbs. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you.
So, Robert, we're here to talk about some nuances associated with radiopharmaceutical therapy. I kind of want to start by talking about the differences in uncertainty in our dosimetry calculations between external beam and radiopharmaceuticals. So an external beam, correct me if I'm wrong, but the total uncertainty budget for dose delivered or a dose that's delivered to a patient's tumor is on the order of around 5%. You have a couple of percent from the calibration of the LINAC, and then you have some traceability that folds in. But in radiopharmaceuticals, I think we're usually somewhere closer to 15, 20, 25 or higher percent. And that's because of the way we're measuring things. But I wonder, is that going to be a real barrier? I mean, what's the reason why it's acceptable that we have such disparate uncertainties?
Well, I think, like Donald Rumsfeld said, you go to war with the army you have, not the army that you wish you had. So it would be nice to have a 5%, uncertainty, but I just don't think that's realistic. I mean, we have those uncertainties that you mentioned, 15, 20% and higher for smaller objects, because it's just intrinsic to the field and how well we can measure what's going on. I don't think it's a barrier. What it does is it creates an additional, since the uncertainty is there, you can't fine tune the dosage as well as you might want to, right? I mean, you have to account for that when you give. Like, you wouldn't be able to prescribe exactly 200 gray. You're going to say, oh, I'm off by 15 or 20%, so maybe I should only prescribe 180. Not great.
Sure. And in the other case, if you say, I want to get a tumor dose of 100 gray, maybe you shoot for 110, 120, just to make sure that you surpass a particular response threshold, right?
Exactly, right.
Yeah. And what is the sort of uncertainty without dosimetry, and how does that compare to when you're actually doing something and controlling the administered activity?
So wait a second. When it was the uncertainty without dosimetry, what do you mean?
Oh, it's just the variance in normal organ dose per activity and tumor dose per activity.
Just like for fixed activity administrations. Yeah. So that's huge. As you well know, the interpatient variability for pretty much any radiopharmaceutical in any given organ can be 50, 60%, factor 2, 3, or even higher. I mean, the distributions are just, the individual patient pharmacokinetics are just dominate the response. So, and they're highly, highly variable. So we would be going from uncertainty that ranges over, a factor of 2 or 3 down to 30%. That's still a huge improvement.
Right. So instead of having to stay a factor of 2 or a factor of 3 below safe levels, we can get much, much closer to an acceptable level relative to normal tissue doses,
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so what about an external beam? So, how much do say monitor units vary for something like a whole brain? Meaning, if you have 2 lateral fields and you pretty much know what the result is going to be. So what's the importance of getting things precise in external beam?
So you're right. Obviously, there are some areas that are much less variable than others. An adult whole brain is probably going to have very similar monitor units if you're aiming for the same dose. But, you need to verify. And, if you start, especially when we're coming into the field like radiopharmaceuticals, the whole brain is actually a really good example because you say, well, this is something where I kind of know what's going on. So you want to start with something where you have a reasonable expectation of the outcome. You have something that's relatively simple. And so if those are the first steps that you take in doing dosimetry, then that's going to help build you confidence because you don't want to jump in the deep end and do something that's very, very complicated. Now, the question of whether it's still valid to do it, the double check in whole brain is still the same thing. I think it's like you don't want to stop, doing your QA and lose track of how it's supposed to go and what it's supposed to do. You're supposed to do the simple things properly as well as the more complicated ones. So I don't think we will ever lose, doing double checks on QA and
Sure.
in whole brain. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think we're in a position now where we want to start with something simple, maybe something like renal dosimetry, and then expand. Once we know that we have a good model, a good system in place, that's where you get to go to something like a craniospinal in external beam, where it's much more complicated and it's not intuitive how much you should be giving in terms of output. That's great. And on that note, I've been talking with Rob Hobbs, and this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Let's talk again soon.